Chapter 2. During the whole Russian campaign, the emperor was usually very badly lodged. We had to comply with necessity. The thing was a trifle hard, to be sure, for people who had nearly always lived in palaces. The emperor resigned himself to it courageously, and all the rest followed suit in consequence. Thanks to the system of burning adopted by the Russian policy, those who were in easy circumstances throughout the country when retiring further into the interior would abandon their houses in ruins to the enemy. To tell the truth, all along the road conducting to Moscow, some rather important towns alone excepted, the habitations were wretched enough. After long and fatiguing marches, we thought ourselves very lucky if we found a hovel on the place indicated by the emperor for headquarters. In quitting these miserable holes, their proprietors would sometimes leave there 2 or 3 poor seats of wooden bedsteads swarming with the vermin, which no invasion frightens. The least dirty rooms was taken when it fortunately proved to be the best ventilated. When the cold weather came, drafts never failed us. When the place was selected and it was decided to remain there, a carpet was laid on the ground. The emperor's bed was set up. On a wretched table was placed the open dressing case, containing whatever might be agreeable or useful in a sleeping chamber. The dressing case included a breakfast service for several persons. All this luxury was displayed whenever the emperor invited his marshals. There was no choice about coming down to the ways of small provincial burghers. If the house had 2 rooms, one served both as sleeping room and dining room. The other was taken for His Majesty's cabinet. The chest of books, the geographical charts, the portfolio, and a table covered with green cloth were all the furniture. This was the council hall. It was from these beggars' hovels that were issued those prompt and trenchant decisions which changed in order of battle and often the fortune of a day, those vivid and energetic proclamations which so quickly reanimated the discouraged army. When our apartment comprised 3 rooms, a case which was extremely rare, then the 3rd room or cabinet was given to the Prince de Neuchâtel, who always slept as near as was possible. We often found old worm-eaten furniture of odd shapes in these wretched habitations, and little images of saints in wood or plaster which the proprietors had left behind. But usually we found poor people in these dwellings, having nothing to save from conquest. They stayed where they were. These good people appeared much ashamed of receiving the Emperor of the French so badly. They gave what they had, and we thought none the worse of them. More poor people than rich ones in Russia have received the Emperor in their houses. The Kremlin was the last palace of foreign kings in which His Majesty slept during the Russian campaign. When we found no houses on the route, we put up the Emperor's tent. It was divided into 3 rooms by curtains so as to contrive several apartments. In one, the Emperor slept. In the second was his cabinet. In the third, his aides-de-camp and chief attendants were accommodated. In this room, the emperor usually ate his meals, which were prepared outside. I alone slept in the chamber. Rustem, who followed His Majesty on horseback when he went out, slept in the couloir of the tent, so as not to be interrupted in a repose very necessary for him. The secretaries slept either in the cabinet or the couloirs. The great officers and chief attendants ate where and as they could. Like common soldiers, they had no scruples against taking a snack when they could get it. Prince Berthier had his tent close to that of His Majesty. He always breakfasted and dined with the emperor. They were inseparable friends. This intercourse was very touching. It was seldom interrupted. I still think there was a slight falling out between the emperor and the marshal when His Majesty quitted the army of Moscow. The old marshal wished to go with him. The emperor refused him. A somewhat lively discussion ensued, which entailed no consequences. On campaign, the meals were served by Monsieur Colin, superintendent of the kitchen, and Rustem as a valet de chambre. In this campaign, more than in any other, the emperor frequently rose during the night, put on his dressing gown, and worked in his cabinet. Very often he had fits of insomnia which he could not overcome. Then, as he found the bed unendurable, he would suddenly spring up, take a book, and read as he walked up and down the room. When he found his head somewhat refreshed, he would go back to bed. He rarely enjoyed uninterrupted sleep for 2 nights together. He would often remain at work in the cabinet until it was the hour for the toilette. Then he would return to his chamber and I would dress him. The emperor took great care of his hands. Yet in this campaign he often relaxed this petty vanity. During the great heats, he no longer wore gloves, finding them too uncomfortable. Hence, through being exposed to the sun, his hands became very much tanned. When the cold weather set in, what had been a coquettish device became a sanitary precaution. The emperor resumed his gloves. He endured the cold with great courage. Still, it was plain that physically he was very much affected by it. It was in Vitebsk that the emperor had several Russian houses pulled down to enlarge the place in front of the house he inhabited, because it was too small to hold reviews there. There was a dilapidated old chapel, which it was likewise necessary to eliminate to attain his end completely. The demolition had already begun when the inhabitants assembled in large numbers, expressing loudly their dissatisfaction with this proceeding, but they were appeased when the emperor gave them permission to take away all the sacred objects contained in the chapel. In consequence of this authorization, several persons entered the holy place, and we saw them come out again bearing with great pomp some wooden images of saints and of large dimensions, which they deposited in other churches. One morning I was present at a guard review of the foot grenadiers of the guard. All the regiments seemed very joyful. It was because General Friant was about to be installed as commander of the corps. The emperor gave him the accolade. It was the only time I ever saw His Majesty do this on campaign. As the general was much beloved by the army, this favor of the emperor was received with universal acclamations. All the promotions were usually welcomed with great enthusiasm by the soldiers, for the emperor insisted on their being made with formality and display. Many persons fancy that to be near the emperor was enough to ensure one's being perfectly well off, even on campaign. This is a great error, which could be contradicted by the kings and princes who followed His Majesty to his wars. If such grand personages as these lacked necessary conveniences, one should reflect that the employees of the different services were very uncomfortable. The emperor himself often dispensed with those ordinary commodities which would have been very agreeable to him after his fatiguing days. One might say that at the hour for the bivouacs there was a general loge qui peut, lodge where one can. Never did the poor soldier find his own destitution made more grievous by the sight of abundance and scandalous luxury in the quarters of his superiors. The chief generals of the army ate their munition bread with as much pleasure as the common soldiers. Never was want more general than during the retreat. This idea of a misfortune shared by all came most opportunely to kindle hope and energy in the most discouraged. It may also be said that sympathy was never more reciprocal between chiefs and soldiers. Thousands of examples might be cited in support of what I advance. When evening came, the fires were lighted. The most fortunate of the marauders would invite some of their companions to share their feast. On days up dearth, cuts of roasted horse were very poor repast to offer, and yet a very good one. Many soldiers would deprive themselves of a good prize to offer it to their leaders. Selfishness was not so general as to prevent this noble French courtesy from reappearing occasionally to recall the happy days of France. We all lay on straw, and those of the marshals who slept in excellent feather beds in Paris did not find this couch too hard in Russia. Monsieur de Beausset gave me a very droll account of one of these nights when, lying pell-mell in very narrow quarters on a little straw, the aides-de-camp summoned to the emperor would pass mercilessly over the legs of their sleeping companions. Luckily enough, the rest had not the pains of gout from which Monsieur de Beausset was suffering, and which were not diminished by such rough and repeated pressures. He cried out in a doleful voice, "It is a butchery, then," and drew his legs up under him, skulking in his corner until the comings and goings should cease for a time. Imagine large, dirty, unfurnished rooms, open to the wind through every window, the panes of which were for the most part broken, dilapidated walls, a fetid atmosphere which we warmed as well as we could by our breathing, a vast litter of straw shaken down as if for horses, and on this litter men shivering with cold, tossing about, pressing against each other, murmuring, swearing, some unable to close an eye, others more lucky, snoring in fine style. And from the midst of this pile of feet and legs the alarm cries in the night when an order from the emperor would come, and you will have an idea of the hostelry and the guests. For my part, so long as the campaign lasted, I never once addressed myself to go to bed, for we found none anywhere. Something else had to be substituted in their place. Now, one knows that necessity is never at a loss for inventions. This is how we supplied for this defect in our furnishings. We had great bags of coarse canvas made, in which we enveloped ourselves completely and then threw ourselves down upon a little straw when we were so lucky as to find any. It was in this manner that I took a little repose during the night for several months together, and even at that I have several times passed 5 or 6 nights without being able to avail myself of it, my service being continual. If you reflect that all these petty sufferings were renewed daily, that when night came we had not even the repose of the bed to refresh our weary limbs, you will get a notion of the burdensome character of our services. Never did the least murmur of impatience escape the emperor when assailed by so many inconveniences. His example endowed us with great courage, and in the end we so accustomed ourselves to this nomadic and fatiguing life that in spite of the cold and the privations of every kind to which we were subjected, we often jested over the poor appearance of our apartments. The emperor was never affected during the campaign, but with the sufferings of others. Not infrequently his health was affected to such a degree as to inspire anxiety, especially when he refused himself all unusual repose. Yet I always saw him taking pains to find out how everything was going, and if there were resting places for all. He was never tranquil until he had been perfectly informed concerning all these details. Although the emperor nearly always had his bed, yet the wretched shelters in which it was set up were frequently so dirty that in spite of all the pains taken to cleanse them, I more than once found in his clothes a sort of vermin extremely uncomfortable and very common in Russia. We suffered still more than the emperor from this filthiness, deprived as we were of clean linen and other changes of clothing, for the larger part of our effects had been burned with the carriages that contained them. This extreme measure had been taken, as is known, for good reason. All the horses were dead of cold and hunger. We were not much better off for beds in the palace of the Tsars, and at the bivouac we had mattresses for several days, but a large number of wounded officers were without any, and the emperor made us give them ours. We made the sacrifice with very willing hearts, and the thought that we were solacing those who were still more unfortunate than ourselves would have made us find the hardest couches good. Besides, throughout this war, we had more than one occasion of learning to put aside all egotistic sentiments and narrow selfishness. We might have been guilty of such forgetfulness if the emperor had not been always there to recall us to this simple and easy duty. Chapter 3. The too famous 29th Bulletin of the Grand Army was not published in Paris, where it was well known what a consternation it produced in all classes until December 16th. And the emperor, coming close on the heels of this solemn manifesto of our disasters, arrived in his capital 48 hours later, as if too paralyzed by his presence the bad effect which this communication must produce. At 11:30 in the evening, December 28th, His Majesty alighted at the Palace of the Tuileries. It was the first time since his advent to the consulate that Paris beheld him return from a campaign without bringing with him a peace conquered by the glory of our arms. On this occasion, the numerous persons who, through attachment for the Empress Josephine, had always seen or thought they saw in her a sort of talismanic protector of the emperor's successes, did not fail to remark that the Russian campaign was the first that had been undertaken since his marriage with Marie-Louise. Without being superstitious, it cannot be denied that if the emperor was always great, even when fortune was against him, there was a very marked difference between the reigns of the two empresses. The one saw nothing but victories, followed by peace. The other only wars, not without glory, but without results, up to the great and final result of the abdication of Fontainebleau. But it would be anticipating events too far to concern ourselves about misfortunes which very few men dared to forebode, even after the disasters of Moscow. Everybody knew that cold and a biting temperature had contributed more towards our reverses than the enemy, whom we had sought even in the midst of his burning capital. France still afforded immense resources, and the emperor was there to accelerate their employment and multiply their value. Besides, no defection had yet been manifested, and with the exception of Spain, Sweden, and Russia, the emperor had none but allies in all the powers of the European continent. It is true that the moment was approaching when General York would give the signal, for as well as I can recollect. The first news of it reached the emperor about the 10th of the following January, and it was easy to see that His Majesty was profoundly affected by it, for he plainly foresaw that Prussia would not fail to find imitators in the other corps of the Allied army. At Smorgoni, where the emperor had left me, setting off himself, as I have said, with the Duke de Vicenza in the calash intended for me, little was thought of how to get out of this frightful plight we were in. Still, I remember that after some moments of regret, because the emperor was no longer in the midst of his lieutenants, the idea of knowing that he was out of all danger became the prevailing sentiment. Such confidence had we in his genius. Moreover, in departing, he had left the command to the King of Naples, whose valor was admired by the army, although I have been told that some of the marshals were secretly jealous of his royal crown. I learned afterwards that the emperor reached Warsaw on the 10th after having avoided passing through the city of Vilna, which he had gone around by way of the Faubourgs, and that at last, after crossing Silesia, he arrived at Dresden, where the good and faithful King of Saxony, sick as he was, had himself carried to the emperor. From there, His Majesty followed the route of Nassau and Mayence. I also took that route, but not with the same rapidity, although I lost no time. Everywhere, and especially in Poland, in all the places where I halted, I was amazed to find such security as I saw displayed. I constantly heard people saying that the emperor was about to return at the head of an army of 300,000 men. Such surprising things had been seen from the emperor that nothing seemed impossible, and I learned that he had himself spread these rumors as he passed by in order to rouse the courage of the populations. In several places, I found difficulty in procuring horses, hence, in spite of my eagerness, I did not reach Paris until 6 or 8 days after the emperor. Hardly had I left the carriage when the emperor, having been informed of my arrival, summoned me. As I made the person whom he had sent observed that I was not in a state which permitted my presenting myself before His Majesty. "That is no matter," was replied. "The emperor wishes you to come at once, just as you are." I obeyed to the minute. I went, or rather ran, to the cabinet of the emperor, where he was with the empress, Queen Hortense, and another person whom I do not remember positively enough to be able to name. The emperor deigned to give me the most benevolent reception, and as the emperor seemed to pay no attention to me, he said with an accent of kindness which I shall never forget, "Louise, don't you recognize Constant?" "I perceive him." Such was the sole response of Her Majesty the Empress, but it was different with Queen Hortense, who welcomed me as her adorable mother had always done. The emperor was very cheerful and seemed to have forgotten all his fatigues. I was about respectfully to withdraw when His Majesty said to me, "No, Constant, stay a moment longer. Tell me what you saw along the road." Even had I had the intention of disguising a part of the truth from the emperor, I was taken unaware and had no time to invent a courteous lie. Therefore, I told him that everywhere as far as Silesia, my eyes had been smitten with a frightful spectacle, that in every place I had seen the dead and the dying, and unhappy wretches hopelessly contending against cold and famine. "It is well," said he. "Go and rest yourself, my child. You must need it. Tomorrow you will resume your service." The next day I did, in fact, resume my duties about the emperor, and found him absolutely the same as he had been before entering on campaign. One might have thought the past no longer existed for him, and that, living already in the future, he beheld victory raging herself once more beneath his banners, and his enemies humiliated and overthrown. It is true that the language of the numerous addresses he received, and of the speeches delivered in his presence by the presidents of the Senate and the Council of State, were not less laudatory than in the past, but it was easy to discern in his replies that if he had been able to feign forgetfulness of the disasters experienced in Russia, he was much more keenly preoccupied with the ill-concerted scheme of General Mallet than with anything else. For my part, I shall not disguise the painful sentiment I experienced the first time I went out in Paris, and when I frequented the public promenades in my hours of leisure. I was struck with the extraordinary number of people in mourning whom I met. They were the wives and sisters of our heroes, mown down in the plains of Russia, but I kept this painful observation to myself. Some days after my return to Paris, their majesties were present at the representation of the opera, where the Jerusalem Delivered was rendered. I, too, went into a box lent me for that evening by Count de Remusat, first chamberlain of the emperor and in charge of the theaters. I witnessed the reception given to the emperor and empress. Never had I seen more enthusiasm. I must avow that I found the transition rather brusque between the recent crossing of the Beresina and this truly magical spectacle. It was a Sunday. I left the theater a little before the end of the play so as to be at the palace when the emperor returned. I was in time to address him, and I remember His Majesty spoke to me that evening of the quarrel which Talma had had a few days before his arrival with Geoffroy. The emperor, though he was very fond of Talma, considered him altogether in the wrong. He repeated several times, an old man, that was inexcusable, parbleu, he added, smiling. Has nobody spoken ill of me? Have I not also my critics, who seldom spare me? He ought to be more susceptible than I am. The affair passed off, however, without disagreeable consequences for Talma. For, I repeat, the emperor liked him very much and overwhelmed him with pensions and presents. In this respect, Talma was one of the small number of privileged persons. For the chapter presence was not His Majesty's strong point. We were then nearing the 1st of January, but we had no castles in Spain to build upon that epoch because the emperor never gave New Year's presents. We knew that we need count on nothing but our emoluments, and for me in especial, it was most impossible to make any savings since the emperor wished my toilette to be extremely elaborate. Truly, it was a most extraordinary thing to see the master of the half of Europe not disdaining to occupy himself with the toilette of his valet de chambre, but he did so, and to such an extent that when he saw me in a new coat which pleased him, he never failed to compliment me on it and to add, "You are very fine, Monsieur Constant." Even at the time of the marriage of the Emperor and Marie-Louise, and at that of the birth of the King of Rome, the persons in His Majesty's private service received no presents. The emperor found that the expenses of these two ceremonies reached too high a figure. Once, however, but not because of any special circumstance, the emperor said to me as I was finishing his toilette, "Constant, go and find Monsieur Meneval. I have ordered him to buy you national bonds bearing 1,800 francs interest." Now it happened that the bonds having risen during the interval between the order and the purchase, instead of 1,800 francs income, I had only 1,700, which I sold not long afterwards, and it was with the proceeds of this sale that I bought a modest property in the forest of Fontainebleau. Sometimes the emperor made presents to the princes and princesses of his family. I was nearly always charged with delivering them, and I can affirm that some 2 or 3 exceptions to functions of porter were perfectly gratuitous ones, a circumstance which I recall here as a simple souvenir. Queen Hortense and Prince Eugène were never included, at least not to my knowledge, in the distribution of the imperial largesses. The Princess Pauline was the person most favored, in spite of the numerous occupations of the emperor, who, since his return from the army, spent a considerable portion of the days and a part of the nights in working in his cabinet. He showed himself more frequently in public than ever before. He would go out almost unattended. January 2nd, 1812, for example, I remember that he went accompanied by Marshal de Roc only to visit the Basilica of Notre Dame, the works of the Archbishop's Palace, and those of the Central Depot of Wines, then crossing the bridge of Austerlitz, the public granaries, and the Elephant Fountain, and finally the Palace of the Bourse, where His Majesty frequently spoke of as the most beautiful monument which would exist in Europe. However, the passion for monuments next to that of war was the keenest that the emperor had. The cold was severe enough during these almost solitary excursions of His Majesty, but in truth the cold of Paris was a very mild temperature for those who returned from Russia. I noticed at this epoch, that is to say at the close of 1812 and the commencement of 1813, that the emperor had never hunted so frequently. 2 or 3 times a week I would help him to put on his livery coat, which, like all the members of his suite, he wore in conformity with the renewed customs of the former monarchy. Several times the empress accompanied him in an open carriage, although the cold was severe, but when he had said anything, there was no observation to be made. Knowing how irksome His Majesty usually found the pleasure of hunting, I was surprised at his new liking for it, but I soon learned that there was a political motive at the bottom of it. One day, when Marshal Duroc was in his chamber, as I was putting on his green coat with gilt lace, I heard the emperor say to the marshal, "I must move about, and the papers must talk about it, since these imbeciles of English journals are daily repeating that I am ill, that I cannot stir, that I am no longer good for anything. Patience! I'll soon make them see that I am as sound in body as in mind." Moreover, I think that the exercise of hunting taken in moderation was very favorable to the emperor's health, for I never saw him in better condition than when the English papers were amusing themselves by making him out a sick man, and possibly their lying announcements helped to make him better still. Chapter 4. January 19th, the emperor sent word to the empress that he was going to hunt in the woods of Grosbois, that he would breakfast at the house of the Princess de Neuchâtel, and that Her Majesty would accompany him. The emperor told me also to go to Grosbois to assist him in changing his linen after the chase. This party took place as the emperor had announced, but what was the surprise of all his suite when, at the moment of re-entering the carriages, His Majesty ordered them to be driven towards Fontainebleau. The empress and the ladies who accompanied her had absolutely nothing but their hunting costumes with them, and the emperor diverted himself somewhat with the tribulations of coquetry experienced by the ladies on finding themselves engaged in a campaign unprovided with toilette ammunition. Before leaving Paris, the emperor had given orders to have everything that the empress might require dispatched in all haste to Fontainebleau. But her ladies were taken unawares, and it was a curious thing to see them sending messenger on messenger as soon as they arrived, in order to have the objects of prime necessity, which they required, dispatched to them without delay. However, it was known very soon that the hunting party and the breakfast at Grosbois were mere pretexts, and that the emperor's object was to terminate in person with the Pope the differences which still existed between His Holiness and His Majesty. Everything having been prepared and signed, the emperor and the Pope on the 25th started an arrangement under the name of Concordat, of which the following is the text. His Majesty, the Emperor and King, and His Holiness, desiring to put an end to the differences which have arisen between them, and to provide for the difficulties that have supervened in several affairs of the Church, have agreed upon the following articles as a suitable basis for the definitive arrangement. Article 1. His Holiness will exercise the pontificate in France and in the Kingdom of Italy in the same manner and the same forms as his predecessors. 2. The ambassadors, ministers, chargés d'affaires of the powers near the Holy Father, and the ambassadors, ministers, and chargés d'affaires whom the Pope may have near foreign powers shall enjoy the immunities and privileges enjoyed by the members of the diplomatic corps. 3. The dominions which the Holy Father possessed and which are not alienated shall be exempt from every sort of tax. They shall be administered by his agents or chargés d'affaires. Those which will be alienated shall be replaced to the extent of 2 million francs of revenue. 4. Within the 6 months that follow the customary notification of nomination by the emperor to the archbishops of the empire and the Kingdom of Italy, the Pope will give canonical institution conformably with the concordats and in virtue of the present indult. The preliminary information will be given by the Metropolitan, the 6 months expiring without the Pope having granted the institution, the Metropolitan, or in default of him. When there is question of the Metropolitan, the oldest bishop of the province shall proceed to the institution of the bishop nominated, so that a see shall never be vacant for more than a year. 5. The Pope will nominate either in France or in the Kingdom of Italy to 10 bishoprics, which will be subsequently designated in concert. 6. The 6 suburbicarian bishoprics shall be reestablished. They will be appointed to by the Pope. The actually existing properties will be restored, and measures taken for those that have been sold on the death of the bishops of Anagni and Rieti. Their dioceses will be reunited to the said 6 bishoprics, conformably to the concert which will exist between His Majesty and the Holy Father. 7. With regard to the bishops of the Roman states absent from their dioceses through force of circumstances, the Holy Father may exert in their favor his right of giving bishoprics in partibus. A pension equal to the income they enjoyed will be given them, and they may be replaced in vacancies, whether of the empire or the Kingdom of Italy. 8. His Majesty and His Holiness will concert together at an opportune time on the reduction to make if there is occasion for it, in the bishoprics of Tuscany and the territory of Genoa, and also in the bishoprics to be established in Holland and the Hanseatic departments. 9. The propaganda, the penitentiary, the archives shall be established in the Holy Father's place of residence. 10. His Majesty will restore to favor the cardinals, bishops, priests, and laics who have incurred his disfavor in consequence of actual events. 11. The Holy Father resorts to the above arrangements through consideration for the existing state of the Church, and in the confidence inspired in him by His Majesty that the latter will grant his powerful protection to the very numerous needs of religion in our times. Napoleon. Fontainebleau, January 25th, 1813. Every possible means has been sought of casting odium on the conduct of the emperor on this occasion. He has been accused of insulting the Pope and even of threatening him. All that is signally untrue. Things occurred in the most becoming manner. Monsieur de Voisin, Bishop of Nantes, an ecclesiastic highly esteemed by the emperor and his favorite intermediary in the frequent discussions that arose between the Pope and His Majesty, came to the Tuileries January 19th. After remaining in private conference with His Majesty for 2 hours, he went to Fontainebleau. It was immediately after this interview that His Majesty entered a carriage with the Empress in hunting costume, followed by all his attendants likewise in hunting costume. Having been notified by the Bishop of Nantes, the Pope was expecting His Majesty, as the important points had been agreed upon and regulated beforehand. There was nothing now in question but certain clauses accessory to the principal end of the Concordat. Hence, it is impossible that the interview should not have been amicable. This verity will become increasingly evident to those who will reflect on the excellent dispositions of the Holy Father towards the Emperor, their mutual friendship, and the admiration inspired by the Pope by the great genius of Napoleon. I affirm then, because I think I can do so, that everything passed off in an honorable way, and that the Concordat was signed freely and without constraint by His Holiness in the presence of the cardinals assembled at Fontainebleau. It is an atrocious calumny to have dared assert that on the reiterated refusals of the Pope, the Emperor put a pen dipped in ink into his hand and, seizing him by the arm and the hair, forced him to sign by saying that he ordered him to do so, and that his disobedience would be punished by perpetual imprisonment. One must have had little knowledge of the Emperor's character to lend credence to this absurd story. A person who was present at this interview, the circumstances of which have been so maliciously distorted, related them all to me. It is in conformity with his account that I am speaking. As soon as he arrived at Fontainebleau, the Emperor paid a visit to the Holy Father, who returned it the following day. This visit lasted for at least 2 hours, during which time His Majesty's countenance was in truth invariably calm and firm, yet full of kindliness and respect for the venerable person of the Pope. Some stipulation of the treaty alarmed the conscience of the Holy Father. The Emperor perceived it, and without waiting for complaints, declared that he abandoned them. This proceeding conquered what remaining scruples there may have been in the midst of His Holiness. A secretary was called and drew up the articles of the treaty, which the Pope approved one after another with a truly paternal bounty. January 25th, the Concordat, having been definitively agreed upon, the Holy Father entered the apartments of Her Majesty the Empress. The two contracting parties seemed equally satisfied. In additional proof that there had been neither trickery nor violence, the Concordat was signed by the august personages in the midst of a magnificent circle of cardinals, bishops, military men, etc. Cardinal Doria acted as Grand Master of Ceremonies, and it was he who received the signatures. I cannot describe the ensuing multitude of felicitations offered and received, the favors asked and granted, the relics, decorations, rosaries, snuff boxes distributed on either side. Cardinal Doria received the gold eagle of the Legion of Honor from His Majesty's own hand. The Grand Eagle was also given to Cardinal Fabrizio Ruffo, Cardinal Maury, the Bishop of Nantes, and the Archbishop of Tours received the Grand Cross of the Order of the Reunion. Finally, the Cardinal of Bayonne and the Bishop of Evreux were made senators by His Majesty. Dr. Porta, the Pope's physician, was given a pension of 12,000 francs, and the ecclesiastical secretary who had come into the cabinet to transcribe the articles of the Concordat was presented with a magnificent ring in brilliance. His Holiness had scarcely signed the Concordat when he repented of it. It was in this fashion that the emperor described the matter to Marshal Kellerman when he was with him at Mayence towards the end of April. The Pope was to dine in public with me on the day after the signing of the famous Concordat of Fontainebleau, but during the night he was ill, or pretended to be so. He was really a lamb, a thoroughly good man, a truly virtuous man whom I esteem, whom I greatly love, and who returns my feeling somewhat, I'm sure. Would you believe, continued His Majesty, that he wrote me 8 days afterwards that he was very sorry that he signed, that his conscience reproached him for it, and that he urgently requested me to consider the Concordat as null and void? That is because as soon as I left him, he fell back into the hands of his habitual counselors, who made a frightful bugbear out of what he had just agreed upon. If we had been alone, I could have done what I pleased about it. I answered him that what he asked was contrary to the interests of France, that moreover, being infallible, he could not have made a mistake, and that his conscience was too ready to take the alarm. As a matter of fact, what was ancient Rome, and what was it now, injured by the imperative consequences of the revolution? Could it retrieve and maintain itself? A government vicious in the political order had succeeded to the ancient Roman legislation, which, without being perfect, was yet capable of forming great men of every kind. Modern Rome has applied to the political order principles which may be worthy of respect in the religious order, and has given them an extension fatal to the welfare of peoples. Thus, charity is the most perfect of Christian virtues. Hence, charity must be given to those who ask it. That is the reasoning which has made Rome the receptacle of the scum of all nations. There you see assembled, so I am told, for I have never been there, all the drones of the earth who come thither for refuge, certain to find abundant nourishment and considerable gifts. So it is that the papal territory, destined by nature to produce immense riches by its position under a fortunate sky, by the multitude of the streams that water it, yet more by the fertility of the soil, is languishing for want of cultivation. Berthier has often told me that you may traverse considerable regions without perceiving the imprint of a man's hand. Even the women who are regarded as most beautiful in Italy are indolent, and their minds are incapable of any activity for the ordinary cares of life. It is the softness of Asiatic manners. Modern Rome has confined itself to maintaining a certain preeminence by the marvels of art which it contains, but we have somewhat lessened that preeminence. The museum is enriched with all those masterpieces of which it was so vain, and before long the beautiful monument of the Bourse, which is being erected in Paris, will surpass all those of Europe, ancient or modern. France before all. To return to the political order, what could the papal government amount to in its actual condition in presence of the great sovereignties of Europe? Old and petty sovereigns ascend the pontifical throne at an age when one no longer aspires to anything but repose. At that period of life, all is routine, all is habit. All they think of is to enjoy their grandeur and make it reflect upon their family. A pope does not arrive at sovereign power, but with a mind contracted by long recourse to intrigue, and with the fear of making powerful enemies who in the end may avenge themselves upon his family, for his successor is always unknown. In fine, all he desires is to live and die tranquilly. For 1/65. How many popes have there not been who occupied themselves with trifles only as uninteresting from the truly religious point of view as they are calculated to inspire contempt for such a government? But this would carry us too far.